In the winter of 1894, a young woman in Montana inherited a stone sheep house so broken her sisters told her to sell it for rubble. 6 weeks later, those same sisters were pounding on its door in a whiteout, begging to be let inside. Because under that rotten floor, their mother had hidden the only warm room for miles. When Eliza Vale died on the 17th of September, she left the world the way she had lived in it, without noise, without fuss, without asking anyone to notice what she had been carrying. She died in the narrow back bedroom of the family boarding house south of Livingston, and before the day was over, her 3 daughters had already begun sorting her life into piles. Clara, the eldest at 32, took the boarding house itself. She had always moved through rooms as if ownership were the same thing as competence. Now, she spoke like a woman settling accounts with fate. June, 28, eager to agree with whoever sounded most certain, took the irrigated hay meadow down by the creek. It was the clean parcel, the obvious parcel, the one with water, fencing, and a path to profit. The cash left after the burial, small as it was, went between them. And to Mara Vale, the youngest at 24, Eliza left a deed to an abandoned limestone lambing house on a rocky slope north of Emigrant, a wind-scoured patch of land 5 miles from town, where almost nothing grew except sage, stubborn grass, and the kind of silence people mistake for emptiness. Clara read that line of the will twice, then laughed once through her nose. A sheep shed, a broken one at that. June said perhaps Mara could pry the stones loose and sell them for retaining walls. Clara said she ought to do it before snow came, because no sane person would sleep up there once the north wind started cutting down the valley. Mara took the deed, folded it once, and slipped it into her coat pocket. She did not argue. She had spent her entire life learning that in some families, the first person to speak is not the person who understands the room best. The next morning, she borrowed a mule cart from Mr. Greeley at the Mercantile, where she spent her days mending harness straps, wrapping sugar in paper, and keeping other people's small emergencies from falling apart. Then she turned north and followed the rutted wagon road out of town. The lambing house sat exactly where memory had left it, on a limestone rise above the valley floor, half hidden by rabbit brush and wind-bent juniper, with one wall buckling outward, and the roof sagging like a tired back. It was worse in some ways than her sisters had said. The plank door had split near the latch. The chimney had collapsed to shoulder height. The roof was patched with old hides, warped boards, and prayer. Inside, the single room smelled of dust, old wool, damp mortar, and years of abandonment. But standing in the middle of that ruin, Mara noticed something that did not belong. The air rising through the gaps in the floorboards was not cold. It was dry, mild. Not the chill breath of bare dirt, but the steady, temperate hush of a place that had decided, somehow, not to surrender to the season above it. She crouched, pressed her palm to a crack, waited. Warmth touched her skin. Not stove heat, not sunlight. Something deeper. Mara fetched the pry bar from the cart and worked at the loosest plank near the center of the room. One board came up, then another, then a third. Below them was darkness, not open ground, but a fitted stone shaft, and a ladder disappearing into it. For a long moment, Mara did not move. Then she lit the lantern she had brought from town, lowered it through the opening, and saw stone walls, shelves, and glass reflecting amber back at her from the dark. She climbed down. The room below was nearly as wide as the lambing house above. A careful vault of limestone and bedrock, dry as a pantry, clean as a chapel, and warmer than it had any right to be. Rows of jars lined the far wall. Peaches, pickled carrots, bean mash, currant preserves, rendered tallow, broth sealed in squat glass jars with wax, every one of them labeled in Eliza's compact handwriting. The earliest date Mara found was 1890. In one corner stood 3 lidded bins filled with oats, barley, and dried beans. In another sat a stack of folded wool blankets, 2 buffalo robes, a crate of candles, lamp chimneys wrapped in cloth, spare matches sealed in tin, and a tool chest holding a brace, an auger, a whetstone, a mallet, nails, wire, and a draw knife sharpened so recently it still flashed clean at the edge. Her mother had not been storing leftovers. She had been building continuity. At the back of the vault, where the bedrock rose in a dark seam, water slipped from a crack no wider than a finger. It ran into a shallow basin, worn smooth in the stone, then vanished through a lower fissure. Mara knelt and touched it. Warm, not hot enough to steam, not loud enough to call itself a spring, just steady, mineral warm, tireless. The rock around it held that warmth and gave it back to the room. A person could freeze to death 50 feet above this place and never know that beneath the floor, the earth was keeping a secret. Mara sat back on her heels and looked at the shelves, the barrels, the stacked fuel bricks, the lantern hooks hammered into the beams. Her mother had been coming here for years. All those Saturdays Eliza had disappeared after chores, saying only that she had errands toward the North Road. All those evenings she had come home with limestone dust in the cuffs of her skirt. All the times Clara had called her vague, and June had called her peculiar. She had been down here, building a winter-proof room by hand, stocking it a little at a time, saying nothing, and leaving it to the daughter least likely to waste it on pride. Mara cried then, not neatly, not in the careful, silent way grief is supposed to appear when other people are watching, but hard and sudden, doubled over with the full understanding of what had just opened beneath her. When it passed, she wiped her face, climbed back up the ladder, and looked across the broken room above with new eyes. This was not a ruin. It was a lid. She had perhaps 6 weeks before the valley turned mean. So she began. She stripped the worst of the roof and salvaged what timber she could. She traded sewing work in town for cedar poles and freight canvas. She hauled stone to reset the chimney. She mixed fresh lime mortar in a wash trough and packed it into the wall joints until the gaps stopped breathing. And because no one on a frontier survives long by pretending competence they do not have, Mara told the truth to the one man likely to understand it. Amos Reed lived 3 miles south, a widowed stonemason turned sheepman, with a beard the color of weathered rope and hands that looked carved from root wood. When Mara showed him the vault, he stood at the bottom of the ladder for so long she thought perhaps he had not heard her explanation. Then he said, very quietly, "Your mother never wasted work on anything that didn't matter." That was all. But after that, Amos came when he could. He showed her how to seat a new stovepipe collar without cracking the roofline, how to square a door frame against a wall that had drifted, how to lay a trap door flush so it vanished into the floor, how to bank heat, stack wood against prevailing weather, and read the sky over the Absarokas for storms that had not yet crossed the ridge. Through October, Mara turned the lambing house tight. She hung a new oak slab door on iron strap hinges. She fitted a real stove upstairs and a smaller iron box stove below, feeding both into the repaired chimney. She built more shelving in the vault. She stretched a rope bed along the warmest wall and stuffed a tick mattress with clean straw. She smoked venison strips over low coals. She brought in flour, salt, coffee, lamp oil, onions, and hard cheese whenever wages and cart space allowed. She cut and stacked nearly 5 cords of wood under a lean-to braced against the north wall. Amos brought her a rangy black dog with one torn ear and the patience of an old shepherd. Mara named him Rook, and he settled into the place as if he had been waiting for it too. By the first week of November, the lambing house no longer looked abandoned. It looked plain, severe, and unimpressed with the weather. The vault below looked better than some homes Mara had known. Over 100 jars filled the shelves. The grain bins were topped off. Blankets were rolled in order. Lanterns hung ready. Water barrels stood sealed. Kindling sat dry in crates by the lower stove. Even the air felt organized. Late one afternoon, Amos climbed down into the warm room, looked around, and let out a slow breath through his nose. "Your mother built this for a bad year." Mara asked if he thought one was coming. Amos looked toward the ceiling, toward the valley beyond it, toward the mountains that had already started catching snow along their upper spine. "I think," he said, "she expected the world to fail exactly where people trust it most." The first true storm struck on the 26th of November, not as a gentle beginning, but as an ambush. At noon, the valley was gray and still. By dusk, the wind had come screaming down off the passes, hard enough to bend the junipers and scour the slope white. Snow drove sideways. The temperature fell so fast, the water bucket by the door skinned over in less than an hour. Mara and Rook stayed below after dark, the lower stove ticking softly, the trapdoor barred, the stone vault holding its calm while the world above tried to tear itself loose. All night the lambing house groaned, but it held. The next day the storm kept going, and the next. When the sky finally broke, Mara had to shoulder the door open against drift packed nearly to the latch. The valley below looked buried alive. Fence lines had vanished, outbuildings leaned under snow. A barn roof near the creek had caved inward completely. No wagon road remained. Only a white blankness crossed by the tops of sage and the black stumps of frozen posts. Over the next week, news came in fragments. The freight road closed. The flour at Hennessy's store was gone by the second day. One ranch family had burned 2 bedsteads and a cedar chest after their woodpile froze under sleet. 3 milk cows were found dead in a collapsed shed east of town. A trapper lost 2 fingers to frostbite on the Yellowstone Trail. Mara listened, added columns to her chalk tally of supplies, measured flour more carefully, shifted more firewood into the lower room. Then, on the 5th of December, the second storm hit. Worse. The wind came at night. Rook heard it before she did. Head up, ears forward, a low sound in his throat. Then came the gale. The lambing house shuddered once, then again, as if something enormous had thrown its shoulder against the wall. Snow hissed through every crack not perfectly sealed. The chimney roared. The stovepipe rattled. Mara had just lowered the trap door when she heard it. 3 blows on the door above. Not wind, a fist. Then another. Then a frantic pounding that carried panic in it so cleanly it cut straight through the storm. She climbed up with the lantern. When she got the door open, the cold hit like a strike. Clara stood there, white with snow from hat brim to boots, her hair blown loose, a blanket wrapped around her shoulders, and another around a small boy she was half dragging by the hand. June was behind her, with a little girl pressed against her chest under a horse blanket gone stiff with ice. For one suspended second, no one spoke. Then Clara said, through chattering teeth, "The house failed." The chimney had cracked. Smoke had backed into every room. A window had blown in. Their fuel was nearly gone. The meadow house June had moved into was worse, drifted shut on the north side and empty of food except for 2 sacks of meal and what little they could carry. They had come because there was nowhere else left to go. Mara looked past them into the storm swallowing the slope. This was the moment, she would remember later, when any cheap form of revenge could have mistaken itself for justice. But the room beneath her feet did not exist for revenge. It existed because Eliza Vale had spent years preparing mercy in secret. Mara stepped aside. "Get inside." She barred the door behind them, crossed the room, and pulled up the trap door. Warm amber light rose from below. Clara stared first at the opening, then at Mara, then back again, as if language had abandoned her. June was already crying by the time she reached the ladder. Down in the vault, the children were wrapped in wool and seated by the stove before they could fully stop shaking. Rook pressed his body against their legs for heat. Mara set broth to warm, cut bread, and added beans, onions, and smoked meat to the iron pot until the room filled with a smell so rich it nearly made June sob harder. Clara stood in the center of the stone room, turning slowly, one hand over her mouth. The shelves, the grain bins, the stacked fuel, the blankets, the lantern glow on stone, the warm seam of water whispering through the bedrock. "It was here," she said at last, barely above a whisper. Mara knew what she meant. All those years. It was here all those years, and none of them had understood what Eliza was doing, because none of them had bothered to imagine she might be doing something more important than what looked respectable from the road. Clara sat on the edge of a blanket roll and began to cry. Not prettily, not strategically, but with the broken sound of a person watching her own certainty come apart. She said she was sorry. June said nothing at all. She just held her daughter and ate in small, desperate bites, like someone relearning that warmth can be trusted. 2 days later, Amos arrived with Mrs. Whitcomb and her 10-year-old son, Levi. Their roof had partially collapsed, and the boy's hands were raw where sleet had found the gaps in his gloves. Then Ben Haskett, the trapper from the Yellowstone Trail, came in half-frozen after following a thread of smoke between gusts. Then a schoolteacher from the lower road, whose stove had cracked at the seam. By Christmas, the room Eliza had built for one household held 10 souls and 1 black dog. It was crowded. It smelled of wool, broth, lamp oil, damp leather, and people sleeping too close together. There were nights when no one could turn over without three others adjusting around them. There were mornings when the last of the coffee was divided by the spoon, and the bread was cut so carefully it felt ceremonial. But it was warm, and it was ordered. Mara kept it that way. She rationed without apology, sent Amos and Ben out to check trap lines and cut deadfall only when the weather opened enough to make risk reasonable, rendered the last tallow clean, dried mittens by the lower stove, melted snow, checked the vent draft, counted jars, re-waxed seals, reset shelves, and kept a ledger of what they used so panic never outran the truth. When tempers flared, she lowered her voice instead of raising it. When fear spread, she answered with tasks. When Clara tried, once, to defer to her in the old sharp tone of older sister authority, everyone in the room went still. Mara did not snap back. She simply looked at the chalk marks on the wall, then at the shelves, then at Clara, and said, "What keeps us alive down here is not who used to decide things." No one challenged her after that. Outside, the winter kept taking. Storm after storm rolled down the valley through December and January and deep into February. Livestock died. Roads disappeared. Men misjudged distances in whiteouts and did not come back. People who had laughed in October stopped laughing by New Year's. Inside the limestone vault, no one died. The children stopped waking in terror every time the wind struck the walls. Mrs. Whitcomb began mending torn coats by lantern light. Ben Haskett, hands bandaged, carved game pegs and trap handles when he could not work outside. June learned to bake flatbread on the stove lid. Clara split kindling, scrubbed pots, and never again spoke of the lambing house as if it were debris. One night in late February, after the others had settled, Clara asked Mara the question that had been sitting between them all winter. "Why you?" Mara looked toward the warm crack in the stone, where water kept moving through darkness older than any of them. Then she said what had slowly become obvious. Because their mother knew the difference between wanting control and being willing to carry responsibility. Spring came late. The first melt ran black down the slope in March, then froze again, then finally loosened for good in April. Snow retreated from fence posts, then from sage tops, then from the road itself. When the valley opened, the people who had lived through winter in the warm room climbed out into a world that looked half broken and half forgiven. Mrs. Whitcomb went to relatives downriver. Ben Haskett returned to his line with scarred fingers and a new respect for walls built by patient hands. The school teacher reopened her little classroom in town. June went back to the creek meadow with her children. But she came every Sabbath after that first thaw, carrying whatever she could spare: flour, eggs, mending, labor. Gratitude she no longer tried to disguise as practicality. Clara never moved back into the boarding house. She stayed on the slope through spring and summer, helping Mara clear stone, fence a garden, and add a second room against the east wall. By the next winter, the old lambing house was no longer a place people pitied. It was a homestead. In time, there was a barn, then a smokehouse, then fruit trees staked against valley wind. The warm vault below remained the heart of it all, steady in every season, shelves full, blankets dry, always ready before anyone else believed ready was necessary. Mara Vale lived there the rest of her life. People later said she had made something valuable out of what everyone else had called worthless. But that was not quite true. The value had already been there. Eliza Vale had hidden it under the floor, stone by stone, jar by jar, winter by winter, until the right daughter found it. She had not left Mara the worst piece of land. She had left her the only place in the valley built to keep other people alive.